Digging into the history of lodging on Sanibel and Captiva is like finding buried treasure on the beach. You find answers to questions like, what key 19th century event brought the first big wave of northern visitors to the islands? Why was gourmet Indian food the cuisine of choice at one of Sanibel's first lodges? How did a Kentucky mountain evangelist, a prominent early 20th century medicine man, and a pioneer in the development of color television each play a role in the history of lodging here? Well, stay tuned because we have those stories and more in this documentary. Be our guest, The History of Lodging on Sanibel and Captiva. It's certainly not unusual for visitors today to enjoy the bay waters of Sanibel and Captiva by boat. But did you know it was just this kind of pleasure cruise that led to the establishment of the first lodging facilities on the islands? In 1889, a Kentucky evangelist by the name of George Barnes was invited to speak in Punta Gorda. The Reverend Barnes was a noted theologian who had spent much of his early career as a Presbyterian missionary in India. But in the latter days of his profession, he returned to the U.S. and was invited to speak all around the country, sometimes with his daughter Marie. During that Punta Gorda engagement, he decided to take a pleasure cruise into the waters of San Carlos Bay. His sloop ran aground within wading distance of Sanibel Island, and the rest, as they say, is history. The Reverend Barnes decided to move his family from Kentucky to Sanibel, where he homesteaded 160 acres and built a small hotel. It was originally called The Sisters, in honor of his two daughters, Marie and Georgia. Today we know it as Casua Ybel.
It was said that George Barnes, a minister, actually built a hotel in self-defense because he had so many visitors.
Betty Anholt is a Sanibel librarian, unofficial island historian, and author of several books about the islands.
It was a word-of-mouth sort of thing, I believe. A lot of people who were very interested in the natural world and this unusual semi-tropical world, so different from what they knew up north. And there was really quite a lot of that sort of exploring the unknown that was going on early on.
The Reverend Barnes thought divine providence had brought him to Sanibel Island. In fact, he built a 200-seat church on his property called Church of the Four Gospels. It was severely damaged in a hurricane in 1910 and eventually torn down. While on return trips to his native Kentucky, he would often extol the virtues of Sanibel Island life. Hallie and William Matthews were among those who heard Barnes praise this area, and because of it, they too moved to Sanibel in 1895. At first, they tried farming, but that didn't work out. So they turned to innkeeping and established the Matthews Hotel on 10 acres of beachfront property. That later became the Island Inn, which still exists today. Now keep in mind that in these early days of the late 1800s and early 1900s, Sanibel was a very primitive setting, mostly made up of farms. You could only get to the islands by steamer or private boat, and once you arrived, a horse and cart would take you to the very few hotels that existed. But like today, the climate, natural beauty, and abundant shelling and fishing opportunities were enough to lure winter visitors. In fact, shelling was so popular among guests at the Island Inn and Casua Ybel that one of Sanibel's most enduring traditions was born in those early days. The original owner of Island Inn, who eventually became known as Granny Matthews, was well liked by guests and island residents alike. She was an avid shell collector herself and encouraged guests to display their daily shell collections on tables outside their cottages that she had designated specifically for that purpose. That tradition continues to this day, and it's said that her efforts led to the creation of the first annual Sanibel Shell Show and Festival in 1938. However, the folks at Casua Ybel say they started their own shell show in 1908, And today's festival is said to be the result of the combined activities of the two lodges. Despite the rustic surroundings, the Sisters Hotel and Matthews Hotel would provide many amenities. Since there were no restaurants on the islands, the inns provided their guests with 3 meals a day. Both the Matthews Hotel and the Sisters Hotel were known for fine dining, where the guests would actually dress formally for dinner. This photo is of an Easter Sunday event at one of the hotels. Beachside buffets were also island traditions and continued well into the 20th century. The Sisters Hotel was known for its gourmet Indian cuisine because the Barnes sisters had spent more than 20 years in India with their missionary parents and learned to cook there. These lodges eventually went on to become important community centers for the islands.
It was a case of when people came to the island, they tended to stay in the general area of their lodging. There wasn't a whole lot of movement around the islands because it was hard to get there. It was horse and buggy or mule and wagon type of things. So they lived there, they ate there, they socialized with the people that were around them. And as they're doing all of that, that becomes their home away from home, so they come back to the same place each year. And that kind of builds up a community, a separate community in several places around the island.
There are 2 other notable lodging stories from early 1900s Sanibel. One was the Sanibel House at Reed's Landing, located on the bay side of the island just west of where the Causeway Bridge lands on Sanibel today. It was also home to the local post office and to the dock where steamers landed with passengers and supplies. But perhaps it was most notable because of its original construction. You see, this hotel was originally a floating hotel, which had been anchored first near Boca Grande in 1902 and later in Captiva Pass. Tarpon fishermen would fish right off the deck of the hotel or take smaller boats, sometimes even canoes, into surrounding waters. These photos were taken on glass negatives by Wall Street mogul-turned-photographer Julian Dymock in 1906. This was about 20 years after the region first gained publicity for tarpon fishing.
It happened in 1885, and it was here in Tarpon Bay, or at that point it was probably called Ellis Bay, after one of the people living in the area. But it was a New Yorker, and he was fishing probably from his boat, yacht, whatever. He caught a tarpon on rod and reel, and because he was a New Yorker, the news quickly spread amongst his peers, and everybody got excited. Once they heard about it, we had multiple visitors coming down. It was a flood. It really was a flood. And of course the benefit of that was we can go down there in the winter and get away from the snow just like they do today.
Our last turn-of-the-century lodging story on Sanibel has to do with blacksmith Samuel Woodring and his wife Anna. They homesteaded 160 acres on the bay side of Sanibel in 1888. When Sam died in 1899, his wife Anna took in boarders from the north in order to care for her family of 3 children. Their house was destroyed in a 1910 hurricane and later rebuilt, but Anna Woodring moved to Fort Myers in 1914 and closed the boarding house. Her son Sam and his wife Esperanza took over the home and ran a very successful fishing guide business from there, which catered to the local hotels.
He was a fisherman by trade as well as a guide, and so she learned, some of that from him, trade as a guide and as a fisherman. So she made a living guiding in the wintertime and commercial fishing in the summertime. And usually 6-7 days a week, whenever the season was here, it started in January or sometimes in December, January, February, March, April. The hotels would fix a basket of sandwiches and whatever else the clients requested to have for lunch. And obviously Mom would provide the fish. $15 a day was the way we started out, 2 people fishing all day, if you will. So that was big money back then.
Reportedly, the first efforts at building a lodging facility on Captiva came from John Dickey, a 19th century drug manufacturer from Bristol, Virginia. At the advice of his doctor, he wintered on Sanibel in 1904. A few years later, he purchased property on Captiva from one of that island's original homesteaders, William Binder. He built a winter home here, then collaborated with 2 friends from Virginia to build what came to be known as the Captiva House Hotel, also known as the Dickey Hotel, and sometimes the Ybel House. It remained an inn until June of 1914, when it was sold to Clarence Snyder to house the Snyder School for Boys, an outdoor adventure school for wealthy young men. According to Eleanor Dormer's 1979 book, The Seashell Islands, A History of Sanibel and Captiva, there was also a 4-room lodge known as the Munsey Hotel on the bay side of Captiva during this period. But reportedly it was demolished by a hurricane in 1910. A Connecticut land speculator by the name of Frank Lane bought the property and over the next 3 years built what came to be known variously as the Captiva Lodge, Captiva Hotel, Bayview Inn, and Fisherman's Lodge. Lane's co-investor in the property was Dr. Franklin Miles, an Indiana physician who had moved to Fort Myers for health reasons in the late 1800s. Dr. Miles was nationally known for inventing various medicinal products aimed at curing common ailments. Later, he went on to found Miles Laboratories, famous for manufacturing such well-known medical products as Alka-Seltzer, one-a-day vitamins, and Bactine. Martha Pickrell's biography of Dr. Miles gives us a pretty good account of what business at Fisherman's Lodge was like in 1923 when Dr. Miles finished a renovation of the facility. According to her book, Dr. Miles wrote, "There seems to be a good prospect of having to double the size of Fisherman's Lodge this fall. Within 27 days from the time it opened, the lodge was compelled to turn away customers for want of rooms. And a month later, its business was surprising everybody, including myself. We're taking in $150 a day on average, and we have a waiting list. We are also surprised at the fine quality of our patrons." Apparently, the lodge also acted as something of a community center for Captiva. In February of 1937, the noted conservationist and cartoonist Ding Darling spoke to an overflow crowd at the lodge about the need to protect natural resources both locally and nationally. Darling became an active resident of Captiva and helped islanders with efforts to get Sanibel and Captiva and surrounding waters named as a state wildlife refuge in 1939. Decades later, long after Darling's death, islanders worked to create a national wildlife refuge on the islands, and it was eventually named in honor of Darling. Today, it is one of the state's most popular natural attractions for tourists. But Ding Darling was not the only famous figure associated with Fisherman's Lodge. Dr. Miles advertised his hotel as the resort of Roosevelt and Wanamaker, which is a good indication of the type of people who would visit Captiva and Sanibel during the 1900s. Roosevelt refers to President Theodore Roosevelt, who visited Captiva off and on during his post-presidential days to fish for tarpon and devil rays, the name then for what we know today as manta rays. Wanamaker refers to John Wanamaker, a Philadelphia-bred department store magnate who is credited with the creation of a fixed price for retail products and for the invention of the price tag itself. The Bayfront Fisherman's Lodge burned to the ground in 1948 and was not rebuilt. However, it lives on today in a building that was once the beach house of the Fisherman's Lodge on the Gulf of Mexico. The Whiteman family bought that building and turned it into the Gulf View Inn. This picture from the early 1940s shows Carl Whiteman and his brother Roy, who lived in the inn with their parents.
I don't know whether they just started doing meals or what, but eventually Gulfview Inn, somehow or another, they acquired 8 units halfway across the island on the south side. and then they started the American plan. Room, board, and maid service, I guess all that's the same. They getting $12 a week per couple. The advertising was word of mouth only, and we always had more people wanting to come than we had room for them.
The building continued to operate as the Gulfview Inn long after the Whiteman sold it and eventually became a private home. But in the 1970s, it turned into a British-style pub that we all know today as the Mucky Duck. There are 5 main reasons Sanibel and Captiva became sought-after destinations for the rich and sometimes famous in the late 1800s and early 1900s. First, our mild winter weather, which often encouraged wealthy people with health problems to visit or move here. Fishing, shelling, beaches and our natural environment, and of course, relaxation or solitude. This 1928 special section of the Fort Myers Press clearly demonstrates these special attributes in both advertising and editorial copy. The headline on one ad reads, "For the world's finest climate, come to these islands." Another early Captiva hotel called the Gore Hotel was also known as Camp Gore because it promoted itself as a fishing camp. Casua Ybel and others listed shelling as an attraction because Sanibel had already gained a reputation as one of the best shelling beaches in the world. A newly opened Captiva hotel owned by Casua Ybel's owners and called the Green Lawn Lodge highlighted an early ecotourism adventure by visiting businessmen. And the Matthews advertised itself as a real home away from home.
It was intimate. You knew everybody else that was on the property. You interacted with them all. It's not like going to a hotel today and you don't have a clue who's on either side of you in the hotel room. It was a social experience.
Historic photos and documents from the early 1900s indicate many famous people took advantage of the solitude offered by Sanibel and Captiva. This is Thomas Edison relaxing on the porch at Casua Ybel. This photo shows Edison's grown children shelling on a Sanibel beach. This is a letter his wife Marina wrote to those same children about her love of shelling on the islands. Ernest Hemingway's mother was often seen relaxing on a Sanibel beach while pursuing her passion for painting. The renowned poet Edna St. Vincent Millay was enjoying a stay at the Palm Lodge on Sanibel in 1938. But her vacation was interrupted one evening. While returning from a walk on the beach with her husband, she saw that her hotel was on fire. She lost an original manuscript in that fire, but was able to later rewrite it from memory. The famous aviator Charles Lindbergh and his wife Anne frequently visited Captiva after their marriage in 1929 and stayed in various private homes and cottages. American violinist Albert Spaulding was also a frequent visitor. The early history of lodging on Sanibel and Captiva is perhaps best summed up by this quote from Deb Gleason's and Charles LaBeouf's postcard history book on Sanibel and Captiva. By 1900, they wrote, "The words Sanibel Captiva were part of the American lexicon. Prosperous sportsmen and warmth seekers had discovered the islands. The island's reputation for seashell collecting, tarpon fishing, and solitude attracted affluent visitors." This reputation would continue well into the 20th century, but changes were on the way. There are 2 very important years in the 20th century that are significant in the history of lodging on Sanibel and Captiva. The first, 1926, when the very first ferry service offering the transport of automobiles as well as passengers and freight was introduced to Sanibel. While this did bring a new form of transportation to the islands, lodging was still dominated by the early inns, boarding houses, and cottages that served affluent visitors who typically stayed for the whole winter. After World War II, however, newer forms of lodging began to develop. Roadside motels, mom-and-pop cottage resorts, bars, restaurants slowly began to spring up because of the expanding post-war economy and the ability to reach the island with a car. Also, electric power service was much improved on the islands in the early 1940s, and air conditioning technology was improving and becoming more affordable.
One of the things I find interesting is this whole restaurant not appearing until after World War II, basically. The concept of the food and the lodging together and then gradually growing apart as hotels, motels appeared and people were more mobile. And since they were more mobile, they could run down the road and go to that restaurant tonight and this restaurant tomorrow night.
Efforts to control mosquitoes were started in the mid-1950s, and the Lee County Mosquito Control District was formed in 1958. Mosquitoes were not much of a problem during the winter season, but longtime residents of the islands who lived here year-round say that before mosquito control, summers were a different story.
On Sea Grape Lane, which is about a quarter of a mile back from the lighthouse, I remember waking up one morning and knew it was daylight, but I didn't know whether the sun was shining or not until I reached up and knocked the mosquitoes off the screen so I could see whether it was sunshine or not. They were that thick on the screen. So we didn't have a lot of people that wanted to come here in the summertime.
Once mosquito control was implemented, there was just one more major barrier to expanding the tourist trade on Sanibel Captiva: access. So that brings us to the second most pivotal year in the history of lodging, 1963. That's when the causeway was built from Ponorosa to Sanibel. This allowed a direct automobile connection to the islands and greatly enhanced the ability of more people to visit. In fact, the first year after construction of the causeway, more than 110,000 cars went through the toll booths, and that annual number has expanded into the millions since then. This led to the development of larger condominium-style resorts, which often took the place of the older cottages developed in the early part of the century. The following stories highlight some of the more significant lodging developments from 1926 to today. The Sisters Hotel was renamed Casua Ybel shortly after the turn of the century and remained in the hands of relatives of the founders until 1923, when it was purchased by Charles Knapp, then sold to Dayton Hotels in 1945. During World War II, Knapp had renovated two of the cottages to house military quarters for soldiers stationed on Sanibel, and beachgoers had to be careful to avoid practice targets that had been set up on the beaches for military planes. Also in the 1940s, a man by the name of Charlie Kohler offered the first seaplane service, which brought passengers to Casua Ybel from Page Field in Fort Myers. There was also a grass landing strip right behind the resort for small planes to use. It remained in service until 1979, when the FAA shut it down. One of the more significant events in the history of the hotel occurred in September of 1966, when fire destroyed one of the landmark buildings that had been built at the turn of the century. Coincidentally, the man who would later become Sanibel's first mayor had planned a family vacation at Casua Ybel and arrived not long after the fire had occurred.
We had two children. We'd been married about 3 or 4 years and never really had a vacation, and spring vacation. It sounded like a great idea.
My sister had 2 children as well. They were just a little older than ours. Ours were 1 and 3, and I think hers were 3 and something, 5.
So this is 3 adults and 4 very small children wending their way over. And we came to Sanibel, we came to Casua Ybel, where we had our reservations, and were informed that there had been a fire and that we wouldn't be staying exactly where we thought we would be, which didn't really matter. But they had accommodations for us, and they were very appropriate for Sanibel, I would say.
And so we were outside. I remember shelling on Casua Ybel Road. Just as good shells there as there were on the beach.
Yeah. Of course, it was all unpaved then. Everything was unpaved. But they lined up 7 cots in a row, and I slept at one end, and then Mariel, and then the 4 kids, and then Mariel's sister at the other end, and it worked out fine.
The next major event in Casua Ybel's experience came in 1977, when the hotel was sold to the Marina Group. They brought needed renovations and updates to the facility and introduced timeshare ownership to the resort. During their renovation, Marina tore down some of the last remaining original cottages. Island singer-songwriter Danny Morgan happened to be staying in one of those cottages and decided to memorialize the event in a song.
I was in my cottage with my guitar, and one day I just started writing a song about the disappearance of the old Casua Ybel and the new Casua Ybel coming in. And there were these pile drivers when they were putting the pilings in for the new buildings, and I was one of the last cottages to be torn down.
Now there's construction men working all day. I hear the sound of the pile drivers pounding away. They'll take down these cottages one at a time, put up those condos all in a line. Farewell, Casua Ybel, you got some stories that you can tell. Still all of us will remember you well. Farewell, Casua Ybel.
Today, Casua Ybel remains as the longest continually operating resort on the islands. If there was ever a true home away from home in the lodging history of Sanibel and Captiva, it would be the Island Inn, known until 1937 as the Matthews. Many of the traditions started by the Matthews family continued well into the 1950s, mostly because the same families kept coming back year after year as guests. In 1957, in an effort to keep the increasingly valuable Gulfront property out of the hands of large hotel chains, longtime guests of the inn formed a shareholder corporation and bought it themselves.
It had some struggles with the changes of how people vacation. You know, the original shareholders who bought the inn in the 50s had passed the share down to maybe their second or third generation. And, you know, people don't typically do that anymore with the 3 months, you know, staying in a hotel.
Chris Davison is the current general manager of Island Inn. He was recruited specifically to help modernize the buildings and operations to attract new visitors, while strategically maintaining the old Florida feel of the resort.
The most important thing for folks to understand about the Island Inn is the inn's commitment to not only Sanibel Island, but to itself. You know, we're on 10 acres, but we only have 49 units. If we were looking at trying to turn the biggest profit possible, we would probably bulldoze the place and build condos or try to maximize the number of units that we have.
One of the things that makes the Island Inn different than any place else is our founders. They created Island Inn so that it would not be turned into a residential condominium development. They were hardcore that this should always be a hotel that was family friendly and would greet guests and have this wonderful open space for the guests and their children.
Joe Orndorff first came to the Island Inn with his mom and dad in 1957. Now he's president of the inn's board of directors and brings his children and grandchildren to visit each year.
Our children really love coming to the Island Inn. It's different. I mean, the traditions that my mom and dad had are not the same as the traditions that I had. And now my children are developing their traditions that bring them back to Sanibel and to the Island Inn year after year.
Periwinkle Park on Sanibel is unique to Sanibel's lodging history in many ways. First, it's the only RV and mobile home park on Sanibel. Second, it's been continuously owned by the same family who started building it in 1963. Third, it has a live bird show that is open to all Sanibel residents and visitors. And lastly, the speed limit on the park's unpaved shell roads is 7.5 miles an hour.
It started back in 1963 when my family was coming down to Sanibel with a small RV. My younger brother and sister were with them, and they were going to stay on Sanibel Island, but they couldn't because the owner of a small park in here didn't allow children. And on the way home, my little sister said, "Dad, why don't you build a trailer park on Sanibel Island?" So all of a sudden the wheels started turning. He came back down in early January and bought the original 16 acres.
Park owner Jerry Mitch says the park currently has more than 320 sites, which include 3 types of lodging. In the park, there are permanent, owner-occupied large mobile homes and smaller units called park models. And in the campground, there are rental slots for recreational vehicles, campers, and tents.
What we tried to do, and this was my father's idea from the inception of the park, we were going to keep this campground forever like it was 55 years ago. We're going to keep the shell roads. We're going to not have the asphalt concrete jungle. We're not going to have all the streetlights except down our main road. We're going to keep all the vegetation. When you walk into this, drive into this campground, you can see us how we were 50 years ago. We're just not going to change. And you got to like us for that. And if you don't, there's other places to go.
The 1930s was the decade that marked the unofficial start of tourist lodging on what is now South Seas Island Resort. Clarence Chadwick was the inventor of a forgery prevention technique for business checks from Denver. He purchased the Captiva property in hopes the winter climate would ease his crippling arthritis. He turned the property into the world's largest producer of key limes. But after a while decided he didn't want to run it anymore, so he turned it over to his wife's relatives. They, in turn, decided to rent out some of the former employee cottages to vacationers. In 1942, it was sold to 2 Connecticut men who had come to Captiva for a fishing trip. They turned it into a small fishing camp called South Seas Plantation. They then sold it to Wally Watts, an executive at RCA, who had helped pioneer the introduction of color television in America. He's the one who added the golf course, built the marina, and helped make the resort resemble what it is today.
So Mr. Watts came in, and there were several things he liked to do. He liked to eat. And so he made the King's Crown into the fine dining room that it ultimately became, and which we continued later on. He liked to play golf, so he built the 9-hole golf course here. He liked to play tennis, so he built some tennis courts next to the marina. He liked boating, so he built the northern basin of the 2 basins in the marina. He built the northern basin. We later built the southern basin. And he fixed up the cottages, and he built the 20-room antebellum plantation house.
Al Tenbrook was a former executive with AT&T who partnered with Bob Taylor to form the Marina Group, the company that purchased South Seas from the Watts family in 1972. The Marina Group provided extensive renovations to the property and started developing new types of vacation units for sale. However, by 1974, the country was in the middle of an energy crisis, and the American economy had stalled. Tenbrook and Taylor decided to try a new approach to selling vacation units called timeshare.
In effect, the sales pitch was, it's a prepaid vacation. You're buying a lifetime of vacations. You pay for it with a down payment and a loan over 4 or 5 years. And the whole sales pitch was, if you rent, what do you have at the end of 10 years? You've got a box full of rental receipts. If you own a timeshare, what do you have at the end of 10 years? You still have your timeshare. So in Christmas of 1974, we had a focus group at the King's Crown, and we invited our guests to come in and see what they could learn about this new type of real estate product called timesharing. And at the end, we said, okay, now if we come forth with something like this, how many of you would be interested in making a purchase? And almost all of them raised their hands.
There was only one competitor on Sanibel and Captiva, and that was Marina Properties, Al Tenbrook and Bob Taylor.
Keith Trowbridge was another local innovator in the timeshare industry and was successful with several properties on Sanibel.
What happened after that, very few motels were built, so it brought that type of building to a screeching halt. And this new concept of ownership by a week took over. And as a matter of fact, in Southwest Florida, there are 60,000 weeks of timesharing.
By the early 1990s, South Seas had 884 units, and Marina had accumulated 9 other resort properties on Sanibel. All were operated under the umbrella name South Seas Resorts. The total package of resorts was sold to a real estate investment company in 1998. One of the first things you notice when you look at the entrance of Tween Waters Inn on Captiva today are all the cottages at the front of the property. Some of these cottages were built in the 1930s by the founders, Bowman and Grace Price. They had purchased the property in 1925 from Reba Fitzpatrick, a tutor for the children of the Dickey family, owners of the Captiva Hotel. To supplement their farming income, they took in boarders. That led to the creation of an inn in 1931. At first, it was just called Mrs. Price's Inn, but the cartoonist and conservationist Dean Darling later became a frequent guest. He suggested they call it Tween Waters because of its unique location between the bay and the Gulf.
Ding Darling was a drive-by. I mean, he would come down with his car and stay for the season. Other people would probably come down and stay 2 or 3 weeks. But it was, coming down here in those days, it was roughing it. It wasn't this as nice as it is today. People came here because they loved the nature, they loved the seclusion. I think they liked it.
Tony Lappy is the president and CEO of Sanibel Captiva Beach Resorts, the company which owns Tween Waters and other island properties. He says the inn stayed in family hands with the Price's daughter, Dottie Wakefield, until the 1950s. She sold it to a holding company, and in 1976, it was purchased again by Rochester Resorts, an investor group led by Lloyd Wright of Rochester, New York. Wright led an effort to restore many of the historic cottages on the property, and in 2011, Tween Waters was listed on the National Register of Historic Places.
Lloyd was a very philanthropic guy and has passed that on to me as well. And we really like to support our community, not just here on the island, but also on the mainland as well. We've been very blessed and fortunate to have a very successful business, and we think it's important to share that. We're kind of unusual because we're owners that are here working. And most owners of a property like this or something would have a management company come and run or do it for them. But we've been kind of homegrown. Our whole company and our whole board of directors like the idea of buy and hold. That's our whole property. That's what we do. And we love the guest experience. We love being with them and enjoying and interacting with them. I mean, that's what hospitality is.
If this A-frame building looks like something out of the 1950s, well, that's because it is. Dean Mitchell opened the Castaways Motel and Marina in the early 1950s in the Santiva district of Sanibel. That's on the far western end of Sanibel near Blind Pass. There was also a Castaways restaurant which served visitors and residents from both Sanibel and Captiva. Today we know it as the Mad Hatter. Castaways included both Gulffront and Bayfront cottages, and was adjacent to another, then separately owned group of bayfront cottages called Betty's Hawaiian Village. Like many visitors to the area, Dal Burnstead and her family had come here many times in the 1970s for the great fishing. By then, Betty's Hawaiian Village had become known as Blind Pass Cottages, and in 1979 they were looking for a manager. Being the fishing enthusiasts that they were, Burnstead and her husband jumped at the opportunity.
The elusive snook drew my father-in-law and my husband like a magnet, We would come down. In those days, you could stand in the pass and snook would run into your legs.
Dal and her husband Jim went on to manage Blind Pass Cottages until 1985, when it was sold and a new management team was brought in. Dal's husband and son became fishing guides, which they still do to this day. But in the meantime, the family had also become owners of the nearby Santiva cottages on the Gulf of Mexico, which had been built in 1972. This lasted until 1991, when a series of tropical storms eroded beaches to the point where Santiva cottages became just a footnote in the history of lodging on the island.
We had just one tropical storm after the other. And in Thanksgiving weekend, we had, I would say, like 4 or 5 tropical storms that year. Never a hurricane, but just a tropical storm, just enough that it kept the Gulf stirred up. It had eroded the beach. The tides were strong. The water kept coming up. And so we had that rough water and those strong tides, and it just kept eroding until it eroded the beach away. And it was funny because the one night, we gave our people, would you like to evacuate? And the people in the front cottage, I said, you need to leave because you're right there. People in the back cottages, I said, I've never had water in this unit. So, do what you want to do. I'll give you your money back. You can stay, you can go. So they opted to leave. Well, the next morning, that whole building was on the ground with no foundation. So I'm standing there outside the building, and I just coincidentally see these people riding by in their car looking and I'm thinking, oh, thank you, Lord, that they evacuated, But the sand just couldn't take it. It just couldn't take the constant bad weather. So it eroded away. And so once they collapsed there in front of the coastal setback, there was no rebuilding them.
If you really want to see what fish camp lodging was like on Captiva nearly a century ago, you don't have to necessarily look at historic photographs. Just visit Jensen's Twin Palms Marina and Resort. Cottages from as far back as the 1930s have been preserved on this property, and some have been registered as historic landmarks. The early ones were built by Ohio truck farmer John Engel, and were said to have been constructed with blocks made from the shell sand of local beaches. There were a few other ownership changes. Then in 1977, Red Jensen and his wife Betty left their home in Michigan and led a group of investors which bought the property. Later, the Jensen family bought out the other partners, and ever since then, the resort and marina have been owned and operated by the Jensen family, most recently by the sons of Red and Betty Jensen, Dave, Jimmy, and John.
I think we get people that want the old, they want the old Florida feel. They don't want the, the modern hotels, which I can understand. People want the bell service and that. We just, you come here, you unwind.
And in the beginning, people would stay for 2 months, that type of thing. We had a lot of farmers, people that, their work was a seasonal type thing. But as time moved on, that changed, and as we know now, it's daily rentals and so forth.
There's always been pressure to, cash in or change to keep up with times. And our dad always impressed on us that you'll never have a place like this again. And you can't go out and buy a place like this again.
Something you said, that was a crushing attack.
Music has become an important part of the more recent history of Twin Palms. Brother Jimmy Jensen is a musician himself, and about 25 years ago, he and his Trouble Starter band started inviting other singer-songwriters from around the country to perform here. It's been said that these concerts were the inspiration for the increasingly popular Island Hopper Songwriter event, produced by Lee County's Visitor and Convention Bureau. But for island regulars and the guests of Twin Palms, it's just one more chance to sit back, relax, and enjoy the best of what Florida used to be.
This is absolutely heaven on earth.
And
it's just one of these places that you come along to, you feel at home.
And you can't help but love this place because it has the atmosphere of a 1950s fishing village. It's a trip back into the past. It's a wonderful journey back into the past.
on a tranquil little island in the Gulf of Mexico.
When your heart is heavy and you're looking for peace of mind, take a ride into Jensen's and drift back in time, where a man named Red found himself a little piece of paradise. He left his snow and ice behind and never thought about it twice.
I think when people come across that causeway, most everybody's attitude changes from the view on the causeway. And when they go back across it, they leave a little bit of their soul behind them. And that's probably the reason they come back. They come back looking for their soul again.
There's a place in Florida where we all like to go, down on the sugar sands off the Gulf of Mexico, where twin palms are swaying to the rhythm of a balmy breeze. Music and laughter ride the wind with a spirit that'll set you free. When your heart is heavy and you're looking for peace of mind, take a ride into Jensen's and drift back in time, where a man named Red found himself a little piece of paradise. He left his snow and ice behind and never thought about it twice. When your heart is heavy and you're looking for peace of mind, take a ride into Jensen's and drift back in time. You're invited along in this song to live a little paradise. Leave your snow and ice behind and never think about it twice. Leave your snow and ice behind and find your paradise.